Evening, everyone. Yes, Viv, there will be sound. I have made sure there's sound. I don't always. Actually, it's ironic. I usually make sure there's sound when there is sound, so it's fine. But yes, I thought I would discuss really a couple of articles that are concerning me. In fact, I'm actually going to go to John at the start, who said the day after the next general election, we'll find the Tories in a worse state than 1997, in all likelihood, indeed. Could this be existential for them, especially regarding polling of people ageing but not moving right? So if we go on to that first, I'm actually going to say no. I don't think the Tories are facing an existential threat, unless you're talking about the Conservative Party as you may have understood it under the likes of Ted Heath, Margaret Thatcher, John Major. It could be that that Conservative Party is facing an existential crisis. But in terms of the political group that's called the Conservative Party, it may change, and that could be quite worrying. But it won't die out because there's too much money in it. I say on a video today, the Conservative Party are basically the party of the billionaires. They lobby for billionaires. That's what they do, or multi-millionaires at least. People with like tens of millions. Those are the people who benefit. The only people who have less than tens of millions of pounds to their name who benefit are the grifters, the ones who shill for them. Their lackeys, MPs, people like Nigel Farage, and so on. But it's what is that Conservative Party going to look like? I actually think I'm going to go through. First of all, let's look at what the polling is like as of this week. I'm going to quickly go through a couple. The one people will know if they've watched my channel for any time. The two pollsters there is a wide variety of quality of pollsters. Some are absolutely awful, and you should never pay any attention to them. Some of them are all right, but there's always going to be problems with any model. No model's perfect. It's actually incredibly difficult. I cannot emphasize enough just how difficult it is to get a voting intention poll anything like right, particularly with a first past the post system. But the two that over the last few years certainly have tended to be the best and not be that far out. Both of them did quite well in 2017 and we within their margin for error in 2019 were YouGov and Ipsos Mori. Now, I often cite YouGov mostly because they produce polls quite regularly and they produce quite a lot of interesting polls, not just the voting intention polls. But YouGov have one massive problem that they don't seem to be able to deal with, and it's the same problem that all online pollsters have. They are inflating the voting intention for Reform UK. Just the nature of the way they're collecting their information is somehow, and if I knew how, then they would know how and they'd be able to cope. It's massively inflating it. So YouGov at the moment have Reform UK on 10%. There's no way 10% of people would actually vote for Reform UK if there was an election tomorrow, right? Ipsos Mori have them as about 5%, and that's actually an improvement. What has clearly happened over the last couple of weeks is the extremists have gotten themselves a platform, and that is working for them, but it's not, I think it's too good. So if you look at Ipsos Mori at the moment, if you were to plug in their polling results, because they've brought out a poll this week, if you were to plug theirs in, that is actually the most flattering for the Conservatives, because the problem, and I think it's probably more, I would actually say at the moment Ipsos is probably the more accurate one, just because if you significantly inflate the Reform UK share of the vote, you get a load of seats going from the Conservatives to Labour that probably won't. So if we plug the Ipsos Mori one in for this week, it has the Conservatives winning 104 seats. And that's the pollster, because I've done this for all the pollsters that have produced results this week, because I think most of the pollsters have produced something. I'm not actually sure I've seen an opinion one this week. I'm not sure. But I've seen quite a lot of the usual suspects. And the Ipsos Mori one is the most flattering to the Conservatives, and it says they'll win 104 seats. And it's like, that is, That is a real problem. Now, imagine this happened. Let us imagine the polls tightened up a little bit and they actually ended up winning 150 seats, right? That, that would be significantly more than Ron for at the moment. But let us imagine that at the moment, it's particularly bad because politics it's in its extreme phase. Like if you look at the left and the right at the moment, what's going on? So the Conservatives are about to announce a budget statement, which, according to reports, is going to include tax cuts for the rich, corporation tax, inheritance tax, right? And to pay for it all, they're going to squeeze the poor, but ordinary people as well, because income tax is going up. Not in a way that the news would say, oh, income tax is going up, but because they're freezing the income tax bands, it means that if you take inflation into account, the bands are effectively coming down. So people are going, without getting a real terms pay increase, they're going up tax bands, so they're going to be paying more tax. Basically, workers in this country are going to pay effectively a higher proportion of their salary in tax. So their income tax is going up in real terms. And that's how it's being paid for. But it's particularly those most vulnerable people who are going to suffer the most. And then you've got the far right who are agitating not just for these tax cuts, but to literally abolish all human rights. That's what they're now openly saying. They're now openly saying you've got people writing in mainstream media outlets that we should get rid of human rights laws, that they have no place in our modern society, that they're a relic from the past, right? That's not hyperbole. That's not like if you did what they said, this would be the consequence. That's actually what they're happy to say. So what are the left doing about this? Are they filling as much? I mean, we know that the left don't really get much of a platform in the mainstream media, but when they have it, are they using this to say, by the way, the Conservatives are raising your income tax it's a stealth income tax rise to pay for an inheritance tax cut, which only affects 4% of people, or corporation tax, which basically doesn't affect any people, just, makes very wealthy corporations make more profit. Are they doing that? No. They're trying to fill the airwaves with an attempt to trip Labour up over a policy which cannot make very much difference at all. And if they were to adopt the policy they want them to adopt, first of all, they wouldn't be happy. They'd want more. But secondly, would actually make things worse in the long run. And so where's the counter? Where's the counter to what the Conservatives are doing? So I'll go through some comments, and I want to start reading what, some of you may have read this, what Suella Braverman put in the Telegraph, because she's trying to come across as reasonable, but it's absolutely appalling. But anyway, Matthew saying, if Braverman became Tory leader, would Reform UK agree a pact? They're supportive of her on offer and criticise Sunak. Who knows? In all honesty, I don't know what Reform UK's game plan is. I honestly don't know. Do they want to become a viable political party? Or do they just want to exist as a protest party to keep the Conservatives tilting right? I honestly do not know. We may find out over the next few years, depending on how they behave. At the moment, they're not a proper political party at all. They've registered, but they have 3 members. Everyone else that pays them is just a subscriber, like a subscriber to the... But they're not a member. There is no AGM for members, or there's no, conference where members can... They have a conference, but there's no conference where members can go and vote on things. There's no infrastructure, really, that involves a membership. There are 3 members of the party. Anyway, John's saying, yeah, Corbyn finally admitted Hamas were terrorists, but it's a bit pathetic. Well, he had to be dragged kicking and screaming to it. It's absolutely abhorrent. And it's like, why not have just said so from the start? But anyway, it's... There we go. Do I think the Tories have decided to go full pantomime villain in time for the Christmas season? It's as if they've totally lost the will to live. They are in complete chaos. In fact, there's a Times article, which I'm going to go over in a bit as well, that alludes to that. So let's start going over this Telegraph article with Suella Braverman. I have put links to these below, but they may be behind paywalls. It's very difficult for me to tell because I have to have subscriptions to all these so I can read what they're doing. So she starts off. So Suella Braverman's written this article, by the way. The Prime Minister has announced that he will introduce emergency legislation to send those who come to our country illegally to Rwanda. That is not true, right? Again, I'll have to emphasise this. It's to send 200 random refugees to Rwanda a year, not people coming here what she calls illegally, which actually isn't illegally, again, remember. She says, I welcome his decision, as do, I'm sure, the clear majority of the British public. Well, not according to polling, but never mind. But it is a larger section of the British public than I would be comfortable with. She says, the immediate issue before us is whether the government can send illegal migrants to a particular country in Africa. The more fundamental question is, where does ultimate authority in the United Kingdom sit? Is it with the British people and their elected representatives in Parliament? Notice she cannot bring the British people into this. There was no manifesto commitment for any of this. Nothing. Sometimes, there's things hinted in a manifesto that's a bit ambiguous and you go, oh dear. So like, for example, when they changed the voting system for the London mayoral election from transferable vote to first past the post, it's like, that wasn't in the manifesto, but it's like, oh yes, it was. Because in the manifesto, it says we are committed to first past the post. So that was ambiguous, it wasn't clear. That's dodgy. There was nothing. In fact, this is the opposite of what's in the Tory manifesto. I should have got the Tory manifesto up. The Tory manifesto has a line in it, and because I didn't get it up, I can't remember exactly the line, so don't quote me on this. But it was about, it was the opposite of this. There was nothing in the manifesto that suggested that they wanted to send refugees to deport them to any country before they'd been processed. There was nothing. So the British public are neither here nor there. They have not been asked to vote on anything like this. So that is wrong. But anyway, so she's basically saying, is the authority with the Parliament, or is it with the vague, shifting and unaccountable concept of international law? Well, first of all, it's not vague because there are courts just like any law, there are courts to tell you what that law means. It's not shifting because it has to get agreement with lots of countries. In fact, international law is far more stable than domestic law because you cannot have international law changed by a single political group. You have to get widespread agreement. And the more global you want that international law to be, the more countries need to agree to it, right? So it's not shifting. And unaccountable, it's not unaccountable because there are courts. Concept of international law. So again, this is absolute nonsense. Right, I'll get some more. I'll have to keep going between comments and the thing because this is quite an exceptional thing here now. The Aussies are now in no doubt about what's the most poisonous and venomous creature in Oz, Farage. Do you know what I saw today? I pay no attention to TV or celebrity news, by the way. But I saw apparently Nigel Farage isn't even going to take part in all the trials. He's getting paid £1.5 million, which will be more than the other contestants. And he's not even going to eat an ostrich's arsehole. Isn't that outrageous? But anyway, do I expect the gap between parties to close a bit as a result of election campaign? What do I think the realistic seats? So that's an interesting one. Yeah, I would normally say when it comes to the campaign itself, the general election campaign starting, I would expect them to tighten, and I'll tell you why. Normally, in the past, I would have said, because the Conservatives always splash the cash and they get really good strategies and they always do a really good job in the election. Because at the moment, in like by-elections and local elections, who's running the show? Who's running their strategy? Tory MPs. Like, it's been Greg Hands for the last year. Now it's going to be the other fellow. I've forgotten his name now. Some other arsehole. But the... Whereas when it's the general election, it's left to the experts. So it'll be they'll run a tighter campaign. So I would always say, but this time I'm not so sure. I think they're going to have slim pickings. The reason I think it will tighten is the other reason. So at the moment, the Conservatives are stunningly unpopular, even amongst Conservatives, right? And it doesn't matter what sort of Conservative you are. whether you're on, the far right, as we would call it, or whether you're sort of centre right, moderate type thing. It really doesn't matter. You're looking at the Conservative Party at the moment and thinking, what the hell is this? If you're very authoritarian and no respect for the law, you're looking at the Conservative Party and going, well, what are they doing? They should just send them to Rwanda and ignore the courts. And if you're sort of a moderate Conservative, you're looking at this and thinking, what the hell are they doing? They're not actually doing anything. They're shitting in our rivers. They're running roughshod over respect for law and order. And hospitals and schools are falling down. We don't want that. So, there's lots of dissatisfaction. So that means there's lots of Conservative voters who voted Conservative last election and have probably voted Conservative for quite a lot of elections on these polls are putting don't know. Now, some of them, when it comes to the election, will hold their nose. They'll just think to themselves, well, it's somehow better than Labour. There are some people like that. That's what they will think. So that's why I expect it to tighten, but I do not expect it to tighten very much. I mean, we don't know when the election is. We don't know what sort of political earthquakes may happen between now and then. But, it is what it is. Oh, One Angry Pagan saying there, let me see. Just watched a vid by Professor Tim Wilson where he was saying that Blair may be a good person to bring in for Starmer in context of Sunak bringing in Cameron. No. No, please, no. Let him go and bring peace in the Middle East. Let him go off. International envoy, yeah, whatever. Because that's what he did when he left Parliament, wasn't it? He was like a Middle East peace envoy, wasn't he? Just do that. There's talk about him doing that again. Just let him do that. No, don't bring him back to government, please. But there we go. Do I have an email address? Yeah, if you go onto my channel, if you click the channel, and in About, there is a link to an email address. I do sort of check it. I don't always reply, I'm afraid. I get a lot of emails, but if it's interesting, I will try and read it. John, as I said today, it's 200. Why is this not noted? And nor is reciprocal agreement to take Rwandan refugees indeed. Written a letter to Guardian and they ignore. Yeah, well, I mean, to be fair, the Guardian would do little with it anyway, even if they did start publishing it. Same with the Mirror. Really, this is the sort of thing that you need to get through in the Times or the Telegraph. You've got no chance with the Daily Mail or the Express. But anyway, right, let's carry on a little bit with the article because I want to get up to the really mad stuff, which is unfortunately later on. So then Braverman says there is no reason to criticise the judges. Well, she's changed her tune. Says they have merely interpreted the law of the land. The fault lies with the politicians who have failed to introduce legislation that would guarantee delivery of our Rwanda partnership. She seems to be forgetting that she was that politician. She was running the Home Office for over a year before this judgment. She was the one who introduced the legislation or not. It's like the fault lies with the politicians who failed to introduce legislation that would guarantee delivery of our Rwanda partnership. She was the one in charge of it. And she doesn't get to claim, oh, Rishi Sunak blocked me. Because it's like, but if it existed, you'd still have it. Like, there's nothing secret about it. As far as I know, there's nothing confidential. If she's written a bill and Sunak said, no, you're not presenting that, I don't know of any legal reason why she couldn't have just kept it anyway and now published it and said, this is what I would have done. But she hasn't done that. All she's talking about is putting lots of notwithstandings in the legislation, which I have to tell you, lots of legal experts have looked at it with furrowed brows and goes, what the hell is she on about? Then she says, this is a good bit. Now is not the time to waste energy on a post-mortem of how we got here. Yeah, because that's her responsibility. How we got here is her, right? Priti Patel as well. Not saying it's all Swella Braverman. Now is not the time to start talking about how I wasted a year messing this up. That's what she's saying. She says, what matters for those of us who believe in effective immigration control is how to move forward. This requires honesty. Yeah, good one. Right, a couple more comments. Irony is abandoning law and order is a dumb move when your opponent is a former prosecutor. Well, That's what I would say. Normally, the Conservatives manage to, the way, when I was growing up, it was always like Labour when you talk about your swing voters, people would sort of understand that Labour was sort of better with the NHS and education, and the Conservatives were better on law and order and defence. And basically, whoever won was the one who could convince the public they were better with the economy. That's how it seemed to me to go. The Conservatives would corner law and order and defence, and Labour, education, healthcare. And it's so for the swing vote, it was right. Okay, that's how it is. Who's better with the economy? Whereas now, yes, Labour have got a senior lawyer and an experienced one. Like Tony Blair was a lawyer, but he entered politics very young, so he didn't really achieve a great deal in his legal career, whereas Starmer, of course, has. And the Conservatives are literally the party that are saying we should ignore the courts, right? But anyway, so I'll miss out the next bit, but I want to go down to what she says. She lays out 5 tests, right? It's always 5 tests, isn't it? Gordon Brown had 5 tests for whether we should join the Euro. It's always 5. Actually, I tell a lie. The DUP had 7 tests, didn't they, for the Windsor framework? I think they went a bit bigger. 40% more tests. But anyway, Swiller Braverman's test. First of all, the bill must address the Supreme Court's concerns regarding Rwanda. It says Parliament is entitled to assert that Rwanda is safe without making any changes to our Rwanda partnership. That's not true at all. The court was very clear, incredibly clear, that they were not just based. They mentioned the fact that the UK government formally describes Rwanda as unsafe for certain people, but they didn't rely on that alone. The court cited an awful lot of evidence, including just what they could see in terms of the way Rwanda behaved with refugees from other countries. They cited Israel, for example. So that there is no way. There is the impression. I'm not a legal expert. The impression I get from legal experts, and it makes sense. There is surely no way of satisfying the Supreme Court. The only way you're going to get any refugees to Rwanda before the election is by somehow, and it's difficult to see how, circumventing the Supreme Court. Right? Then she says the bill must enable flights before the next general election when it ain't happening. Now, she does say here, legislation must therefore circumvent the lengthy process of further domestic litigation, in other words, going to court, to ensure that flights can take off as soon as possible, as soon as the new bill becomes law. She says to do this, the bill must exclude all avenues of legal challenge. The entirety of the Human Rights Act and European Convention on Human Rights and other relevant international obligations or legislation, including the Refugee Convention, UN, must be disapplied by way of clear notwithstanding clauses. Well, first of all, there's nothing clear about notwithstanding clauses in her context. Her law degree is French. I don't think we can blame the French on this one. But there we go. But I mean, isn't that remarkable? She's actually saying this is the former Home Secretary saying we now need to disapply all human rights laws in the UK. All of them, every single one. To send 200 people to Rwanda. I saw Starmer has said, this is a slight tangent. Starmer has said Cameron needs to state publicly what went on with Greensill. It's Johnson all over again. Get them to state their facts, then prove them wrong. The thing is, I mean, Labour, of course, will point at the David Cameron because it's classic Tory sleaze, isn't it? It's classic Tory sleaze. But I think David Cameron's not really that popular. He's considered more. I think the best you could say about Rishi Sunak bringing David Cameron in for Sunak, I mean, I said it myself. It was a good move, and I still say it was a good move on balance. And it's because, yeah, he's unpopular, but is he more unpopular than other members of the cabinet? No. He's just unpopular, as in there's more people dislike him than like him, or respect him, shall we say, as a politician. but he's no more unpopular than other members of the cabinet. He's certainly not less popular than the Conservative Party. But it's like Rishi Sunak himself. I mean, Rishi Sunak is not any longer, he used to be, but he's not any longer popular. But there's a lot of voters still think he's credible. They actually see him as a bit like John Major, whereas John Major in the 90s was seen as if he was a decent man, but he was just let down by his cabinet colleagues. Little did we know at the time he was having an adulterous affair. So he wasn't that decent, I suppose. But by comparison. And it's the same with Rishi Sunak. There's a lot of people look at Rishi Sunak and think he's essentially, if only the rest of them were like him, it'd be all right. It's like, no, because he's just robbing us blind. But that is the perception. At least with Gordon Brown, you assumed he stopped at 5. This is like the test because he only needed 5, whereas a lot of Tory ministers, it's probably they can't remember more. Yeah, but I think that was the same reason, though. Whenever a politician say, oh, I'm going to apply some tests to this to see whether I agree with it or not, it's always because either they want it and they want to be able to show that they've got some good reason to support it, or they don't want it. So when Gordon Brown came up with his tests for whether we should join the euro, they were so airy-fairy, you could say what you like. It was quite clear Gordon Brown did not want to join the euro, right? That's what all political tests are for. They're either to ram something through without too much scrutiny by saying, oh no, we applied tests, look, there you go, they met the test. Or it's to block something completely, even if all the experts say, no, this would actually be a really good idea. Labour had 5 tests on whether to support May's Brexit deal. Yeah, it's very often 5. You'll find, as I say, if it weren't for the DUP recent Windsor framework shenanigans, I would just say it was almost exclusively 5. The DUP had tests 8 to 14 ready to go in case the Windsor framework passed the first 7. I think if you look at the first 7 again, because that's the other thing, when you look at 5, they're never. Sometimes there's the odd objective test in there, but they're never all objective. They're never the sort of test you could give to some experts and they would reliably come back with a predictable assessment. There's always some ambiguity in there that allows you that makes it look like you could go either way. But anyway, you say you're surprised that Cameron joined as he ran at the first sign of trouble before. There'll be something in it for Cameron. It may just be the seat in the House of Lords. It may well be that Cameron is doing this just for that seat in the House of Lords, in all honesty. But Cameron is not doing this out the goodness of his heart. He's not doing it because he wants to do the Conservative Party a solid. He will be doing it for selfish reasons. That is certain. Sunak will also not have brought him in just to try and stabilise the government. They may have that impact. Why has the biscuit and cheese aisle shrunk in every supermarket? Long life goods costings by shop, or wheat shortage, or Brexit? There'll be a mix of things. Obviously, as we always say, Brexit isn't 100% responsible for absolutely everything. When you've got one of the largest agricultural exporters in Europe being invaded, that obviously is going to impact things like that. But we do know that Brexit has made it more difficult to get goods into the country or materials into the country to produce goods. So I noticed that I'm a big fan of the old cheese and biscuits. I have been having them tonight, in fact. But yes. Edwina bankrupted my mate's chicken farm. Oh yeah, she was the old salmonella one, wasn't she? Yes, I remember that. I was quite young at the time. But anyway, so let's go on now because we're halfway through. I haven't finished that Telegraph one, but that was the more remarkable bit for me. It was that beginning bit where she's just trying to sound reasonable, but she's just coming up with absolute nonsense. And then that test 2, literally suspending all human rights laws, all of them, every single one, just to get 200 people to Rwanda against their will. including potentially unaccompanied children, because they couldn't actually, the government when this was going through Parliament, they couldn't actually promise that there would be no unaccompanied children going. That was, the whole thing was terrible. But I mean, imagine that, just the evil of that. Then I'm just going to pour myself a drink, and then I'm just going to go to a Times article that I think's just come out today, and it chronologically is before this point because it describes how Rishi Sunak reacted to the judgment. This was incredible. So, basically, this Times article, if I was to sort of give you the too long didn't read version, I might go over a few bits. On Wednesday morning, Rishi Sunak apparently was quite happy because he'd achieved his aim with getting David Cameron in. Suella Braverman had been sacked. She wasn't on the front pages, really. There was the odd little mention, but mostly the front pages were David Cameron. That was much bigger news than sacking Suella Braverman. So it's achieved his short-term aim. The news that CPI inflation had gone down to half of what it was last year was out, and the media were duly reporting it as Sunak meeting one of his pledges, even though, as I did it in a video, this is not true, but never mind. At the end of the day, it's like that in the media, so politically it is true. So he was quite happy. He was getting all these positive headlines. Braverman was sacked, which was not necessarily popular with the entire Conservative Party, but it was popular with the public. It was even amongst most Conservative voters. So he'd done something popular. Then the inflation thing was again more good news. Bringing David Cameron in was a net plus. There was this is more of a mixed bag, but on balance, it's a positive for him. And then the Supreme Court ruling came out, and it's not that it found against the government. They did sort of think that there was a good chance of that happening. No one really knew for certain, but there was a lot of legal experts thinking it probably will go against them. But the judgment basically gave the government no wriggle room. What some legal experts that I were following were suggesting is they thought there might be something that Sunak could work with. There'd be something in the judgment that would allow him to sort of change tack a little bit and essentially go for the same thing. And it didn't. So this hasty press conference that they arranged for that afternoon, where they said, oh yeah, we're going to go with a slightly different plan. The reason why that plan is complete nonsense, it's like, oh, we're just going to declare Rwanda safe, that should do it. It's like, that's not going to do it. And also, if it was as simple as that, why does he need to lay primary legislation before the House? Why doesn't he just get Parliament, like House of Commons? Why don't you just get the House of Commons? Why don't you just present a motion that says this House agrees that Rwanda is a safe country, a safe destination for refugees? Why doesn't it just say that? And given that they only want, or they're only able to send 200 a year, why don't they at least identify which refugees are at risk in Rwanda and only send those who they think might get on all right? There's none of that. It's like, oh, we're just going to make it safe. But according to this Times article, because they didn't expect the judgment to be so airtight, because it really was, it closed off every possible avenue for the government. It really was, again, I'm not a legal expert, but according to legal experts who had a look at it, it was really a case of you need to drop this because you've got no wriggle room here. You've got no wriggle room. The only way you can possibly get refugees to Rwanda now is by doing what Braverman says and completely disapplying all human rights laws in this country, which I have to tell you would be incredible. I mean, I think I mentioned it in a video. People maybe don't realise, or not enough people realise, that our international obligations also, those international frameworks, underpin trade deals as well as like other agreements. I mean, the Good Friday Agreement very famously is built directly on the European Convention on Human Rights. If you disapply the European Convention on Human Rights in the UK, the Good Friday Agreement disappears up its own arsehole. So you can only imagine what the United States, and it makes no difference who's in the White House, by the way. It makes no difference. Republicans and Democrats alike will do their nut. then, but then it's trade deals as well. You know, lots of these international rules underpin trade deals. So we'd have a lot of trade deals we would be reneging on trade deals by disapplying those common international conventions and rules. So a lot of our trade deals would disappear in smoke as well. Where's the talk of that in the media? What's the difference between a Tory and a Conservative? So there used to be a very clear difference. All I will say is these days, I tend to use them slightly differently. If I'm referring to the party, I'll sometimes call it one or the other. Basically, I tend to use the word Tory as the word originated, you know, in Irish Gaelic, which is basically when I'm referring to a Conservative MP as basically a brigand or a thief, I'll address them as a Tory. So if I'm talking about really dishonest, nasty behaviour, I'll tend to use the word Tory. Whereas if I'm just talking about someone who might be a member of the party or a supporter of the party or even an MP, where I'm not particularly alluding to any unpleasant behaviour, I will call them a Conservative MP. That is usually how I do it. So I try and distinguish, but it's not clear. I mean, that's just my little thing. So yeah, I tend to use the word Tory if I'm describing someone doing something really very awful, and Conservative if it's either neutral or not. So Damien Green, when he attacked Suella Braverman, I would describe him as a Conservative MP when he's doing that, and Suella Braverman I would describe as a Tory MP. That's just how it works in my head. But I have an idea. Send the cabinet off to Rwanda to work from there for 6 months and let them prove it's a safe country. I'd vote for that. For them, it will be a safe country, though. That's the problem. That's the thing. If you're rich, if you want to go on holiday, I'm sure it is paradise. I mean, I'm not sure I would trust it still. But if you're rich, I'm quite sure they look after you. I'm quite sure if you're wealthy and you're going there on holiday, you will be going to areas that have got very tight security. You will be well looked after, yeah? Because you're spending lots of money there. If you're a refugee going to Rwanda, what benefit are you to Rwanda? Why would they keep you safe? You know, you're not bringing any money. There's been money paid for you, but that money's already been paid no matter what happens to you, because they know full well the British government don't give a shit. They just want their headline, because that's what they want. What they want, and this is why Suella Braverman's going on, we must have these flights before the election. It's like, why? Because they want to put it on their campaign flyers. They want to put it in their campaign literature. Oh, the flights have gone off. Oh, we had these problems, but we sorted them out. We know how to fix things. That's what they want. But it says here, and sorry, I'm going back to this Times article, that Rishi Sunak was absolutely in a foul mood. Now, you think to yourself, again, this for anyone who thinks that Sunak is essentially sort of decent, even if you sort of think, yeah, but he's a crap politician, but he's essentially normal as politicians go. He's normal. He don't want to do all these terrible things, that he's a moderate or something. You know, imagine being furious that the Supreme Court told you can't send refugees to Rwanda. Imagine being in a foul mood all day because of that. That's not a nice person. That is not the behaviour of a nice person. But anyway, Wendy's saying the economies of scale doesn't make UK slave labour cost effective with economies that would tolerate slave labour goods. They don't think of these things, though. I mean, there's a lot of, as I say, there's a lot of thinking from these people that is very limited. You know, like I said, really, if you're going to have right-wing economic views, you have to be in favour of quite a lot of immigration. It makes no sense for Conservatives to be small state and low immigration, because it's like, well, you've got to have one or the other. Because if you have low immigration, then that means, again, I keep putting it in this term, it's really simple. Imagine a worker. Where's that worker come from? If they're a domestic worker, they were born and raised in that country, in the UK in this case. So the state has had to pay for their education and training. And when they retire, it will have to pay for that as well. So It has to, you know, you could be in education for a good 20 years on average. You can be more for some and less for others, but you know, you can be in education for 20. So you're paying, the state is paying for them for 20 years when they're not really economically active. And then they retire. Okay, if Ian Duncan Smith gets his way, we retire at 70. At the moment, it's like, is it 67 or 68? Can't remember. But let's say it's going to end up, for someone who's 20 now, it ends up being 70, right? So you're going to have 50 years where you're working, and then you're going to have about, what, an average of 34 or some 35 years when you're retired. So 55 years, which is more than half your expected life, your life expectancy, is going to be you not economically active. So you're talking about not economically active for the first 20 years of your life and the last 35 years of your life, right? But the state has to supply you. The state has to support you, okay? Now, if you get an immigrant, they've been educated somewhere else and possibly trained somewhere else. They come to this country, they work, so they're straight away working and paying their taxes. Some may retire. Some may spend so long here and they like it and they retire here. But that is a number that's less than 100%. Some of them, most of them, will retire somewhere else, probably in their own homeland. So with an immigrant, you don't pay for that education, or you don't pay all of it, and you don't pay for their retirement in many cases. So if you want a small state, it makes sense to have a lot of immigration, but they go the opposite way. It doesn't make sense. That's why it doesn't work. You know, David Cameron had, and George Osborne had various ideas about how the economy works, and then they buggered the economy because, do you know what, it doesn't work. You can't just shrink the state and expect everything to carry on as normal. You can't expect the economy to carry on. It's a bit like getting a car and refusing to put petrol in. I'm going to save money by not putting petrol in it. And then all of a sudden you're broken down on the A1 wondering what's happening. But anyway, right, let's go through some comments. Oh, there's a long one there. Hang on, we'll get to that in a moment. In fact, Big Mavinsky is saying, yeah, Rwanda has an amazing coastline if you have the cash. Yes. I mean, like a lot of places, there's a lot of places that are really absolutely terrible places to go if you've got no money, and they will seem like paradise if you have. Are the Tories now putting everything on a successful trade deal with India as their last throw of the dice? Sunak is, because he wants it personally. I think Tories would be mad because we know if he agrees an India trade deal, we know that it will have to include much easier visas for Indian workers, which means many more Indian workers being able to get visas. I have to say, being realistic, India isn't that bothered about a trade deal with us. There is a bit of, because obviously in Britain and India have a little bit of a history. You may know about this, and a lot of people in India will enjoy getting one over on the former colonial master, because unlike France, France's relationship with its former colonies is a little bit different. With some of them, I know it's not all of them. I've made this point before, and someone say, "Oh, but what about it?" Okay, not all of them, but in some cases, France actually, in its post-colonial period, fostered good relationships with some of its former colonies. Britain didn't really do that. You know, we played cricket with some, including India. We get on all right when it comes to a cricket match, but by and large, we didn't exactly leave in good, and we certainly didn't actively try to foster good relationships afterwards. I mean, the Commonwealth was not, I mean, that was just what it was. We basically abandoned them, I think. So there are some in India who would not mind getting a trade deal that is the equivalent of pulling Britain's pants down and giving it a good kick up the arse. You know, like in Australia and New Zealand, where they were literally pissing themselves laughing at the trade deal they got with us. There are some in India who would like that. But in terms of the value to India of a trade deal with the UK, it's not really that great. So they will be asking a high price for it because they're not that bothered. There's not a great deal in it for them just to get a bog standard cut and paste free trade agreement. It doesn't really help them. So that is why they will definitely insist on the visas. which you would think would be a tough sell for the Conservatives. So I'm not sure how much the Conservatives as a party are all that bothered about the India trade deal, other than it's got some good pro-Brexit headlines. Is that tiny red thing on the photo behind you, Sweller's heart? Looks about right. It's on the wrong side, but then that would be quite that would be right for her, wouldn't it? I'm saying there, yes. The word Tory does come from Irish Gaelic, means bandit or brigand, vagabond, thief. But yeah, I mean, that's what it means. I often say this. I cannot believe for the life of me that Tories actually call themselves Tories, given what the word means. It's amazing. Do you know how these days you actually have now Tory MPs using the term do-gooder as a term of, like Priti Patel used to use the term do-gooder as a term of offence, as if it's a bad thing to be someone who does good. And, you know, and it's sort of like, it's almost like she's doing it in the spirit of the first people who said, oh, yeah, oh, the Irish are calling us Tories. What does that mean? It means bandits. Oh, right, so that's good. We'll call ourselves Tories. We like that. It's mad. I'd be interested in that. I actually don't know the reason. I don't know the history of that. I'd be interested in knowing why Tories thought it would be a good idea to adopt the word themselves. Does India as a country benefit from the visas? As a country, not necessarily, but individual businesses do, including Infosys, which is Rishi Sunak's father-in-law's company. Obviously, large multinational corporation. It's got, you know, it's got businesses in Britain. Effectively, it's got like premises in Britain. It acts in Britain. It would be brilliant for them if they could just send their workers from India to the UK with like an easy visa process, you know, like a rubber stamp job. So it would be absolutely brilliant for Infosys to be able to just send their workers from India to their UK premises to work. Bold of you to assume Sweller has a heart. Yes, indeed. But yeah, what we've seen over the last week has been utter chaos. And it uses the term chaos and confusion here because Sunak, after that, he was really happy on Monday morning. Then the judgment came out. It was completely unexpected, not the binary, whether it's lawful or not. The fact that it gave them no wriggle room for a plan B. So when Suella Braverman said there was no plan B, she was probably telling the truth. Although you would ask yourself, why wasn't there a plan B? It's actually quite interesting because Robert Jenrick, her immigration minister, who's still the immigration minister, I think, said, because he was being asked about it, because he was saying, oh yes, we were already working on this just in case the result went against us. And you know, Sweller and I were working on an alternative plan for months, to which he was then told, well, Sweller Braverman says that you have no plan B. Is she lying? And he went, oh, no, she's not lying. It's like, well, which is it then? But, you know, when you look at this judgment, if they did have a plan B or C or D, they'll all be in the bin because it cuts off everything. If you can't somehow circumvent the Supreme Court by either disapplying all the laws, international and domestic, that they cited, or just telling the Supreme Court it's not allowed to judge on government plans at all, unless you either nobble the court or nobble the law, there is, you know, there's no way through this. Emerson, I think I missed your comment from earlier. Yes, that often happens, doesn't it? Do I think David Cameron's a coward? Yes, of course he's a coward. He's a coward. I mean, there's two clear pieces of evidence for that. First of all, he backs down to the ERG. He knew a Brexit referendum would be an insane idea. He would have known that. He thought he was being clever about it, but he should have stood up to them. Basically, all David Cameron had to say, because the pressure on him, so to speak, was from, oh, but UKIP, they're hassling us, they're going to win our seats. This was nonsense, by the way, absolute nonsense. In 2015, even though they promised the referendum, UKIP got massive vote share. Did they get a load of seats? Did they, Egg? So David Cameron should have just said, bollocks, stop agitating. If you agitate, all you're going to do is let Ed Miliband in. That's all any Tory leader has to do to enforce party discipline. If you've got some idiots who want you to adopt a crazy policy, say, are you mental? If we do this, we'll split the party and it'll let Labour in. And they could, so he could have said, do you want Ed Miliband to win the election? Because that's how you get Ed Miliband winning the election. And then after 2015, he could say, do you want Jeremy Corbyn winning? Because that's how Jeremy Corbyn wins. It's all you have to do, really. Or it's all he had to do. The second thing is, he promised, didn't he, that if the country voted to leave, that he would steer the country through that. He said he would take responsibility. So then the country voted to leave. What was his first action? Was it, right, we're going to get a team together to work out how we manage this? It was, no, I'm off. I'm resigning. I'm off. You can sort it all out now. So, of course, he's a coward, an abject coward. How will people react to Hunt cutting tax for the wealthiest by hitting the poorest? Why do papers talk about £13 billion headroom but forget Truss's £50 billion black hole, 37 billion in the hole still? So, a few things in there. First of all, how will people react to him hitting the poorest? Unfortunately, they won't care. That's the tragedy of it all. People who are willing to vote Conservative are voting for selfish reasons. We just have to accept that. That's the nature of it. When you vote for the Conservatives, no one votes for the Conservatives for the common good. People vote for the Conservatives because they think it's better for them personally. That's the nature of people who vote Conservative. Whether it's like as a swing voter, like changing one election to the other, or whether it's like, on a more long-term basis. That is the motivation. And because poor people do not vote in large enough numbers, because they generally don't see... It's unfortunate because there's be a lot of... you're talking about basically the bottom 20% of people. I mean, that's a large section of the electorate that doesn't vote, unfortunately, in very large numbers. So that would be a huge chunk. So that doesn't affect it at all. However, the fact that they'll also be hitting middle income earners, that's more serious. And I do not understand how Hunt thinks that he's going to win, or that any of his Tory MPs think that he's going to win votes by cutting inheritance tax whilst forcing people into... Because it doesn't matter whether people realise their income tax is going up or not. Doesn't matter. They'll feel it, because it is going up in real terms. They'll feel it in lower living standards. People next year are going to carry on feeling that they're having to cut back on things they didn't used to have to cut back on. There's no way of getting around that. In terms of this fiscal headroom, it's a bit of a fiddle if it's based on the fact that borrowing was lower than they expected. Now, remember, borrowing is still rising, but borrowing is lower than expected. But here's the thing. If you say, borrowing was 13 billion less than we expected, I think it was actually, 10 billion or something? I can't remember. I'll have to look it up. But if you're going to say borrowing was this amount less than we expected, you can't then say, so we can use it for tax cuts, because then you're saying you're using money that you were borrowing. That's borrowing for tax cuts. So in order to fund tax cuts, if they want the Office for Budgetary Responsibility to say this is not the most mental idea ever, they're going to have to, and it is still a mental idea, because if you cut the income of the poorest, they're the people who spend that money in the local economy. Cutting inheritance tax, where does that money go? Does that go into the local economy? No, it does not. It gets pugged away somewhere. If you're lucky, it at least gets put into a British bank account, but mostly it doesn't. So it's, the only way they can do it is by cutting spending. But public service has been pared to the bone. So what they're actually talking about is taking money off people who will recycle it in the economy and giving it to people who won't, who'll just take it out of the economy. Be just gone. How can we incentivize poor people to vote? It's very difficult because there was an Ipsos, in the Ipsos poll this week, which didn't just poll voting intention. It noted that there were significantly more people think that Labour's policies will be better in the long term than the Conservatives, but there's about 50% of people who think there's not much difference between them. All right. And if you think that's 50% of people, and if you think that, then why would you? You know, and that is the tragedy of people, particularly on the left, because you can understand the Conservatives doing it, but particularly people on the left trying to suggest to you, like, it's one thing to say we don't think Labour go far enough on this policy or that policy or the other policy, right? But when you're actively saying, oh, there's no difference between them, the two cheeks of the same arse, you know, when you've got people on the left actually saying that Labour are basically the same as the Tories, then the people who benefit from a Labour government are, if they believe it, and many do, then they're less inclined to vote, because why would you vote if you don't think it's going to make a difference? So how we can incentivize poor people? We need people en masse. We need lots and lots of voices to show the difference. I mean, yes, I keep saying it would help if Labour were better at getting through to people. You know, I keep saying Labour need to use social media properly to actually get those messages out. But we also need lots of others to do it as well. I mean, you know, unless you can go to people and say, look, this is Labour's policy on this, and this is the Conservatives' massive difference. This is Labour's policy on this other thing. Conservatives' massive difference. Unless you do that, and you can do it for all those people, you know, I don't blame them for not voting, because if they believe that there isn't really much difference, then, you know, why would you? Do I foresee Labour ever backing compulsory voting? I very much doubt it. I think it's just a cultural thing in this country. We don't like the idea of being told what to do. We're quite rebellious. PR will do. PR will do. That is viable. That is it's a viable campaign to get Labour to do it, because there really isn't very much resistance within the Labour Party against it. I know it doesn't always seem that way. The resistance has really been broken down. That's not to say I think I'm confident it'll happen, because there are still obstacles to overcome, and they can't be overcome by just sitting back and waiting. They have to be torn down, but there we go. One Angry Peg is saying, what likely are going to be the tangible effects of the Labour government in the next 4 years? How likely are they to make serious economical changes? So, if I was to, I'm doing this off the top of my head, if I was to point at some of the things that will make a noticeable impact, note that the first thing Labour are doing, and they're making no secret of this, is introducing their workers' rights bill. I don't know exactly what they're calling it, employment rights bill, workers' rights bill, whatever. But they're massively increasing workers' rights. And they're doing it first thing. So they're going to get that done in the first 3 months, they say. Now, you think to yourself, so, okay, well, that's nice. No, it's more than that. It will empower workers to be able to demand better work conditions and pay over the next few years. Because what we need is for people's pay to start rising in real terms. And a bill like that will help that. Now, it's not in its own the big thing. So that's one thing that will make a major difference. The second thing is Labour's general policy of basically their entire industrial strategy is based around decisions being made by all the stakeholders. So they're going to have business leaders involved in decisions of investment. It's like, well, you know, everyone does that. They're going to have trade unions involved as well as related experts. So this sort of real proper fusion of trade unions and business leaders and other stakeholders to make decisions is going to, it doesn't mean every investment decision will end up being a good one, but it will mean that you massively increase the chances of it being quite useful. It will, because the thing is as well, when you've got different stakeholders who all ultimately want slightly different things, it means you get more robust criticism. And you need criticism to end up with better systems. So that would be a second one. A third one I would say is actually, if you look at the massive amounts of corruption going on, the amount of public money that's just been funneled into the hands of people who don't spend it. Imagine the difference you could make if you just got £50 billion that under the Tories in a given year would go into the hands of people who don't spend it, and instead funnel that £50 billion into the hands of people who will spend it in the local economy. That would make a significant difference as well in terms of supporting businesses. And then and we know lumped into that as well is the removal of quite a lot of tax breaks will raise extra money. I don't know how much. I don't know exactly. I know some of the tax breaks that are going. I don't know all of them. They haven't announced all of them. But just removing some tax breaks generates more money without raising people's taxes. And then the fourth thing I would say is actively trying to align with the EU. You know, there's various things we can do quite easily. The Pan-European Mediterranean Convention. Labour want their veterinary agreement. I don't know how credible that is or how quickly they can get it. But if they can get that, that would be huge. But the fact that, like, Labour are openly talking about just basically full alignment with the EU as far as they can. Starmer has said he has no problem with full, not dynamic alignment, because you can't say that, because then that's basically saying, oh, we're just going to adopt EU rules without even looking at them. He has said, you know, full alignment in areas where it's in our interest. So it's like implying picking and choosing, but in reality is basically, I suspect, going to be largely dynamic alignment. But where they look at it first and not just give it a blank check. So those would be four things that I think will make a significant difference. It's important, however, that it doesn't just make a significant difference to the economy, as in pure GDP terms. It has to make a people have to feel it. Because what's going to happen next year, for all Rishi Sunak going on about inflation and, oh, we're cutting inheritance tax, people will feel that things are getting worse, because they are. Core inflation is not coming down very quickly. Income tax is going up in real terms. This is squeezing people still. It's going to carry on squeezing the next year, and they'll feel that. So Labour need to get them to feel like the pressure's coming off. Like, instead of, oh, we used to be able to afford this and now we can't, get them to think, oh, we weren't able to afford this last year, now we can. That's what Labour need to do. Really important. And I think they understand that. I think they get that. But anyway, there we go. Thanks very much for coming on, everyone. Have a very good evening. And until next time, I'll see you later.